Get him out of my hotel now." Harrison Whitmore did not shout it. That was the part that turned the blood cold. He said it the way a man sends back a steak, quiet and bored and certain, and 300 people in the grand ballroom of the Beaumont went so silent you could hear the ice settling in their glasses. A string quartet stopped mid-phrase by the staircase. A server froze with a tray of champagne trembling at his shoulder. And under the honeyed light of a dozen antique chandeliers, the richest man in Charleston pointed one manicured finger at a paramedic in a borrowed charcoal suit and said it again, louder so the back of the room could hear. "I said, get this filth off my property." "Sir," the man answered, and his voice did not shake. "He's your daughter's husband." "My daughter has no husband. She has a mistake." Harrison's mouth curled. A broke black ambulance driver from the projects out on Reed Street. A boy who wipes strangers in the back of a van and thinks that makes him a man. "You put your hands on my family name." Look at him, gutter trash in a rented tuxedo. The suit wasn't rented. But the man didn't say so. He just stood there while 400 years of Charleston pressed down on his shoulders, and he did not look away. And he did not raise his voice, and somehow that stillness was louder than anything Harrison Whitmore had ever screamed in his life. "Caroline." Harrison turned to his own daughter, and his eyes went flat as harbor water. "You walk out that door with him. You walk out of this family. No trust, no inheritance, no name, nothing." She took her husband's hand. "Then I have no father." Somewhere in that room, a woman gasped behind a diamond bracelet. Two men near the bar found their shoes fascinating. A United States senator became very interested in his phone, and 300 of the most powerful people in South Carolina stood in their silk and their pearls and their tailored wool, and not one of them said a single word. That is what a room full of powerful people is best at. Watching someone bleed and calling it manners now. Here is the thing none of them noticed. Not the senator, not the developers, not Harrison Whitmore himself, standing there under a 6-foot oil portrait of his own face. Under the collar of that charcoal suit, on a thin steel chain against the paramedic's chest, hung a small brass hotel room key. Number 214, worn smooth, older than the man wearing it. And in 90 days, that key and the woman it belonged to would take everything Harrison Whitmore had ever built and grind it into the heart pine floor he was so proud of. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand how a hotel king lost his entire empire over one gala, one recording, and one signed page he never bothered to read, you have to understand 3 things. You have to understand who that quiet man in the charcoal suit really was. You have to understand the woman who was at that very moment stepping out of a black Suburban under the porte cochere on East Bay Street. And you have to understand a promise made 70 years ago. On the knees of a girl, scrubbing a marble floor, she was not allowed to walk across. So let me take you back, not to the ballroom, to a laundry room in 1951. Because that is where this story actually begins. 6 hours before Harrison Whitmore pointed his finger, the man in the charcoal suit was on his knees on a cracked kitchen floor in a public housing block off Reed Street, breathing for a 9-year-old boy who had nearly stopped. His name was Elijah Carter. He was 34 years old, a nationally registered paramedic with Charleston County EMS, and he had been on shift for 13 hours. Unit 41 smelled the way it always smelled by hour 13, like antiseptic and diesel, and the metallic ghost of somebody's worst day. The boy on the floor was named Marcus. Asthma, the bad kind, the kind that comes on a humid low-country night and closes a child's throat like a fist. His grandmother stood in the doorway with both hands pressed over her mouth. His inhaler was empty. It had been empty for a week because the refill cost $41 and rent had come first. Elijah did not think about the $41. He thought about the airway. He got the nebulizer going, watched the small chest fight for it, kept his voice low, and even the whole time, because a scared child hears the fear in a grown man's voice before he hears the words. "Look at me, buddy. You breathe when I breathe. In. Good. That's it." Slow. He held the boy's hand through the whole ride to Mu-S-East, and somewhere around the Cooper River Bridge, the monitor stopped screaming, and Marcus looked up at him with wet eyes and whispered, "Am I gonna be okay?" And Elijah said, "Not on my watch." That was the job. It didn't pay much. It didn't come with a name people recognized. But it was his, all the way down, and no man alive could say he'd been handed it. He walked out of the emergency bay at 5:15 and drove to the station in a 2009 Ford Ranger the color of dried mud. A dent in the tailgate he kept meaning to hammer out and never did. He clocked out. He sat in the truck a minute with his forehead on the cracked steering wheel, letting the marsh heat settle over him. And his phone buzzed. Caroline, babe, I have to tell you something. He already knew. He knew from the small, careful breath she took first, the one she only ever used when her father was in the room. He says you can't come tonight. Doesn't he? Silence on the line. Then he says if you come, he'll make a scene. In front of the whole board. He means it, Eli. Elijah let out a slow breath and looked through the windshield at the heat shimmer rising off the asphalt. He had met Harrison Whitmore exactly 3 times in 4 years. And he remembered all 3 the way you remember a burn. The first time was at a fundraiser. The spring he and Caroline had been dating 6 months. She had wanted her father to meet the man she loved. Harrison had shaken Elijah's hand for exactly 1 second, looked straight through him at a state senator across the room, and walked off mid-sentence. He never once asked Elijah's name. The second time was worse because it was quieter. A Sunday lunch at the house on Laguerre Street, Caroline's idea, a peace offering. Harrison had waited until Elijah stepped out to take a work call, then said to his daughter, loud enough to carry through the screen door, "This little rebellion of yours will pass, sweetheart. They always do. You'll thank me." Elijah had stood on the porch with his phone in his hand and heard every word and walked back in and said nothing, because Caroline was already crying, and she didn't need him to make it a war. The third time there was no meeting at all, just a courier on a Tuesday with a cream envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $75,000 and a single typed card. "For your trouble, move along quietly." Elijah never cashed it. He put the card in the drawer of his nightstand under his father's old watch as a reminder of exactly who Harrison Whitmore was and exactly what men like him thought a man like Elijah could be bought for. "Caroline, it's all right," he said now, into the phone. "I'll stay home with Naomi, it's fine." "No," her voice sharpened. "You're my husband. You have every right to stand in that room next to me. Your daddy doesn't see it that way." "My daddy doesn't see a lot of things, Eli. That's his sin, not ours." He looked at the photograph clipped to the sun visor. Naomi, 6 years old, 2 missing front teeth, purple beads on the ends of her braids, grinning like the world had never once told her no. Their neighbor, Miss Yvonne, was already set to keep her for the night. "Caroline," he said, "gentler now. I don't ever want to be the reason there's a fight in your family. You have never once been the reason. He is, every single time. A pause. There's a suit on the bed for you. It's yours. I bought it, it fits, and I don't care what he says about it. Please, come stand next to me tonight." And that was the thing about Caroline Whitmore. She had grown up in a house with a name older than the country, and she had looked at all of it, the trust and the portraits and the pew with the family plaque. And she had chosen a man who held children's hands on kitchen floors for $18 an hour. That choice was going to cost her everything before the night was over. She made it anyway. She made it gladly. Elijah found the suit an hour later in the little 2-bedroom on Aiken Street. Charcoal, well cut, quietly expensive in the way that never announces itself. It fit like it had been waiting for him. And then he did the thing he always did before he walked into a room where strangers had already decided who he was. He reached up and touched the thin steel chain at his throat and drew out the small brass key that hung from it. Room 214. The paper tag looped through the ring was soft as cloth now. The ink of the handwriting on it faded almost to nothing, but he knew every letter of it by heart. He pressed it to his lips once, the way his mother had taught him, and tucked it back inside his collar, against his chest, where it had ridden every hard day of his adult life. Elijah Carter never told people where the money in his family came from. Mostly because they'd have laughed, because there wasn't supposed to be any. When strangers asked, he said his father passed when he was 10 and his mother was in real estate. Both true, as far as they went. But not one word of it was the whole truth. And the whole truth started with a girl named Ruth. Ruth Carter came up on John's Island in the 1940s, the granddaughter of people who had worked the fields there against their will, in the years when the low country ran on rice and cruelty in equal measure. She came into Charleston proper as a girl of 16, because a black girl in 1950 could get steady work in exactly one part of the grand hotels along the harbor, the part behind the wall. She cleaned rooms at the old Fort Sumter house and later at the Francis Marion, 12 floors of marble and mahogany and money. She scrubbed floors she was not permitted to cross as a guest. She rode the freight elevator, ate her cold lunch on an upturned crate by the boiler because the staff had no break room, and used the service door on the alley off King Street, the one the fine people never saw. She was good at it. She was fast and thorough, and she took a private pride in a corner folded just so, a mirror with no streak, a room left better than she found it. The pride was hers. Nobody could dock her pay for it, and nobody could take it away. Every night she came home to a shotgun house on the east side, past the corner where the men played checkers under a street lamp, and she cooked red rice in a dented pot, and told her daughter Odessa the same thing, in the same steady voice, night after night after night. Baby, they will let you clean the palace. They just won't let you live in it. So don't you spend your one life polishing another woman's brass. You go build your own. Ruth kept exactly one thing from all those years. When the hotel gutted its old wing in 1951, the foreman, who was not a cruel man, only a tired one, told the maids they could take a keepsake from the rooms being torn out before the crews came. Some took a lampshade, a hand towel, a little soap wrapped in gold paper. Ruth took a brass room key, number 214. The first room she ever cleaned on her first morning when she was 17 and terrified and so proud she thought her chest would split. She looped a paper tag through the ring and wrote on it in her careful Sunday school hand, and she pressed it into her daughter's palm and folded the small fingers over it and said, "This is not a memory, Odessa. This is a promise. You hold on to it until it comes true." Odessa held on to it through everything, and there was a great deal to hold on to. Have you ever been handed something by someone who gave up their whole life so you could have a shot at yours? A thing that weighs nothing in your hand and everything on your soul? If you have, then you already understand why 60 years later, a grown man would wear a rubbed, smooth brass key into a ballroom full of people who thought he was nobody. He wasn't carrying a key. He was carrying his grandmother. Odessa Carter buried her mother at the age of 30. She buried her husband at 34. Samuel Carter was a good man with a strong back and a soft laugh who worked the shrimp docks and then the container yards down at the port, loading steel boxes off ships in the wet Charleston heat. He had a bad heart valve nobody caught, because men like Sam didn't get physicals. They got another shift. He collapsed on the dock on a Tuesday in October and was gone before the ambulance crossed the drawbridge. He left behind a widow, a 10-year-old boy named Elijah, and a mortgage on a leaky guest house on Cannon Street that took in maybe 4 travelers a week and lost money on 3 of them. Odessa could have sold it. Everyone told her to sell it. Instead, she got down on her knees with a bucket, the way her mother had gone down on her knees at the Francis Marion, and she scrubbed those rooms herself while her son did his long division at the front desk under a lamp with a cracked shade. She learned the business one hard night at a time. She learned which travelers tipped and which ones stole the towels. She learned to fix a running toilet and negotiate with a linen supplier and smile at a man who'd just called her girl. And she learned the one thing the old Charleston money never had to learn, because they were born already knowing it in their bones, and never once questioned it. She learned that the man who owns the land under the hotel always outlives the man who merely runs it. So Odessa Carter did something quiet and patient and ruthless. She stopped chasing hotels. She started buying the ground they stood on. She bought the failing bed and breakfast next door at a tax sale for $11,000 and change. She bought a storm-battered motel out on Folly Beach that a spooked owner dumped after a hurricane. And then, as the dollars grew from thousands into millions across 20 years of 18-hour days, she began buying the dirt and the bones under the grand old houses themselves, the flagship hotels with the famous names, and leasing them right back to the proud men who wanted the glory of running a 5-star palace without the burden of owning the walls. She built it all inside a trust with a plain, forgettable name, Sterling Meridian. Nothing on the sign said Carter. Nothing on the sign said anything at all. That was the point. By the time her son was in high school, Sterling Meridian Hospitality Trust quietly held the real estate under a dozen of the finest hotels in the American South. And one of its largest tenants, one of the men who signed her leases and ran her buildings under his own gilded name, and never once in his life wondered whose land he was standing on, was a hotelier from an old Rice family named Harrison Whitmore. 4 years before the gala, in a closing that made no headlines, Sterling Meridian had bought the ground under his crown jewel itself, the Beaumont, the very floor where, one autumn evening, he would point his finger at Odessa Carter's only child and call him filth. She never told a soul her name meant anything. She let the industry believe she was a fund, a faceless trust, a signature at the bottom of a lease. And she raised her boy to do exactly the same. She could have sent Elijah to Wharton. She had the money for it, and then some. But the summer he turned 17, a man dropped dead of a heart attack on the sidewalk right outside their guest house on Cannon Street, and a young paramedic knelt over him in the gutter and worked and brought the man back from the other side, right there on the pavement, and then stood up, wiped his hands, and got in his rig and drove off to do it again for somebody else. Elijah watched the whole thing from the porch steps. He came inside that night and said, "Mama, I want to be the one whose hands do that." Odessa Carter, who had cleaned toilets so her son would never have to, looked at that boy for a long moment. She could have told him about the money. She could have told him the empire would one day be his, that he never needed to work another day if he didn't want to. She didn't. She understood something most rich parents die without ever learning, that the worth of a life is not the size of the empire it leaves behind. It is the number of hands it holds on the way through the world. You want to save people, she said. Then go save them. But you do it as Elijah Carter, paramedic. Not as Odessa Carter's boy. You earn every ounce of what folks think of you, so that no man alive can ever say you were handed a thing. And when you've earned it, you'll know something the whole world will never be able to take from you. You'll know exactly what you're worth. He took it to heart harder than she ever imagined. There is a story Odessa still tells about the winter Elijah was 12. A guest at the Cannon Street house, a traveling salesman running late and short-tempered, snapped his fingers at the boy in the lobby and told him to fetch his bags and be quick about it, and pressed a crumpled dollar into his hand like he was tipping a dog. Young Elijah brought the bags down without a word, but that night at supper he asked his mother why the man had talked to him like that. And Odessa set down her fork and looked at her son a long time. "Because he decided who you were before you opened your mouth," she said. "People will do that to you your whole life, baby. And you cannot stop them from deciding. But you can decide whether they're right. You carry those bags because it's your job and you do your job well, not because he snapped his fingers. You hear the difference?" He heard it. He kept the dollar in a jar on his dresser for years, not as a wound, but as a reminder. A man is not what other people decide he is. A man is what he does when they've decided wrong. 22 years later, he would stand in a ballroom and hear a much richer man snap his fingers at him in a much fancier way, and he would carry himself exactly the way his mother taught him, and it would drive Harrison Whitmore out of his mind, because a man who cannot make you small has no power over you at all. He worked his way through Trident Technical College at night, riding along on weekends, cleaning rigs for the overtime. He finished top of his paramedic class. He moved into a walk-up he could afford on his own salary, and he never once, not for 11 years, spent a dollar of his mother's money or dropped her name to open a door. When people asked what his mother did, he said real estate and changed the subject and meant no disrespect by it. It was the opposite of disrespect, it was the whole point. Now here is a detail that matters later, so hold on to it. Do you know how Elijah Carter met Caroline Whitmore? It wasn't at a party. It was at one of her father's own charity galas, 4 years before this story. A night Harrison Whitmore would give anything to forget. An elderly donor collapsed at his table, cardiac arrest, right there among the orchids and the crystal, and the county sent Unit 41. Elijah walked into that gilded room in his gray uniform, knelt on the marble in front of 200 horrified millionaires, and calmly, methodically, brought a dead man back to life while the band stopped playing. Caroline was volunteering that night, checking coats. She rode in the ambulance because the man was her godfather, and she spent the whole ride watching a stranger keep her godfather alive with nothing but his hands and a low, steady voice that said, "Stay with me now, I've got you." She said later she fell in love somewhere on the Cooper River Bridge, and she never fell out. Her father had shaken Elijah's hand that night too, briefly, and forgotten his face by morning, the same way he forgot every face that wore a uniform. Remember that. It comes back around. The night before the gala that would change everything, Elijah drove out to his mother's house on the Isle of Palms, the modest one, not the showpiece, and they sat on the back porch and shelled boiled peanuts and watched the light go long over the marsh. He told her about Harrison, about the check, about the way Caroline cried on Sundays. And Odessa Carter listened the way she always listened, all the way to the bottom, and then she reached up and unclasped the chain from her own neck, the one that held the brass key, and she leaned over and fastened it around her son's. "I want you to wear this tomorrow," she said. "Room 214. Your grandmother cleaned that room the first morning she ever set foot in a hotel in this city. She wasn't allowed to sleep in it. She wasn't allowed to walk through the front door. And now her grandson owns the buildings, and her granddaughter-in-law loves you. And her great-granddaughter has never once been made to use a service entrance in her life. That is not a memory, baby. It's a promise that came true. You wear it into whatever tomorrow is, and you hold your head up. Not because of who I am, because of who she was." He did not know driving home that night that he would need it. He thought he was going to a party. He was going to war. He just didn't know it yet. Now come back with me to the Beaumont, to the ballroom, to the moment just before the ice went silent in 300 glasses. Harrison Whitmore was on his third bourbon of the evening, and the Founders' Gala was, as always, his masterpiece. He held it every autumn in the Flagship, the finest hotel south of Washington, a building his great-grandfather had supposedly willed into existence, though the truth of that was fuzzier than the family liked to admit. 300 guests filled the grand ballroom. Senators and developers, bankers and old-money widows, the whole soft aristocracy of the Low Country gathered under brass chandeliers and swags of Confederate jazzmen. A string quartet played Handel by the sweeping staircase. Servers in pressed white jackets threaded the crowd with flutes of Krug on silver trays, and above it all, at the top of the stairs, hung a 6-foot oil portrait of Harrison himself, chin lifted, hand on a globe, painted 10 years and 40 pounds ago. He worked the room with handshakes calibrated to the dollar, firm and warm for equals, brief for lessers, non-existent for anyone beneath his tis, which was most people. His wife Margaret drifted a half-step behind in oyster silk, murmuring corrections to the event coordinator, a young woman who had not slept in 2 days, making sure the magnolias were the right white. Everything was flawless. Everything was under control. That was how Harrison liked the world, flawless and under his control. Then he looked toward the tall brass doors, and his glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Caroline walked in, and Elijah walked in beside her, one hand resting light at the small of her back, the charcoal suit catching the chandelier light, the brass key hidden against his chest. His daughter had defied him in his own house, on his own night, in front of every person whose opinion he had spent a lifetime buying. Something behind Harrison's eyes went very cold and very still. Margaret touched his sleeve and said, "Lo, Harrison, not here." He was already moving. "You know how it went from there because you were there when this story started. But you didn't see the room. You didn't see the small, ugly choices 300 people made in the space of 90 seconds. You didn't see the way the developer from Mount Pleasant, a man Elijah had once treated for a broken wrist at a construction site, turned his back and pretended to study the dessert table. You didn't see the wife of a federal judge lift her chin and look right through Elijah the way you look through a waiter. Because to her, that is exactly what he was. You didn't see the young associates from Harrison's own company go pale and rigid along the wall, each one calculating in real time the precise cost of speaking versus the precise cost of staying silent, and each one arriving at the same cowardly arithmetic. Nobody moves, nobody helps. That is the sound a spine makes when it decides it would rather keep its job. Harrison circled Elijah slowly, the way a man circles a stain on his carpet. "Nice suit," he said. "Who bought it for you?" Because a man hauling bodies for the county sure didn't. Elijah said nothing. That was the thing about him that Harrison could not stand and could not understand. His silence had weight. His silence made loud men keep talking until they said the thing that hanged them. "You people always do this," Harrison said, and those two words dropped into the room like a struck match onto dry pine. "You find something you didn't build, and you attach yourself to it. My grandfather built this company from nothing. My father grew it. And I will not stand in my own ballroom and watch a boy from a housing project put the Whitmore name on a birth certificate." Then he reached into his jacket and produced the document. Cream stock, heavy, folded once, he held it up between two fingers like a verdict already decided. "My attorneys drew this up this morning," he announced to the room, because subtlety had left him somewhere around the second bourbon. 28 pages, a post-nuptial agreement. He set it on a cocktail table beside a sweating, abandoned flute. "It states that this man waives every claim to Whitmore assets forever. Every trust, every property, every share. And any child from before," he added, his eyes flicking to Caroline, "gets nothing. Not 1 cent. Now or ever you're talking about my daughter," Elijah said. Something behind his eyes went sharp as a scalpel. Caroline snatched the pages off the table and flipped through them, and her hands began to shake. Not with fear, but with a fury that was years in the building. "There's a clause in here," she said, her voice climbing, "that says Eli needs your written permission to attend any family event. Christmases, funerals, signed by you. And here, if he's ever deemed an embarrassment to the brand, my marriage can be annulled and I get nothing. Who decides what counts as an embarrassment, Daddy?" "I do," Harrison said. Caroline looked at her father for a long moment. "This isn't a contract, it's a leash. It's a choice," he said, and clasped his hands behind his back like a man well pleased. "He signs tonight, he stays, back table, eats quietly, keeps his mouth shut, and you keep your inheritance. Or he doesn't sign, and you lose all of it. The trust, $600 million gone. The house on Laguerre Street gone. Your seat on this board gone. Everything you have ever known." And then he turned and spread his arms to the whole silent room, because a cruel man is never crueler than when he has an audience. "Let me be plain for everyone here tonight," he said. "My daughter has chosen to marry a broke black ambulance driver from public housing. A man with nothing to offer this family but shame. I want every single person in this room to witness the quality of her judgment." The words landed like a slap, and here at last in a room of 300 cowards, one person moved. His name was Deshaun Boyd. He was 22 years old. He had grown up off Rivers Avenue in North Charleston, raised by a grandmother and a mother who worked 2 jobs. And he was working this gala for $18 an hour and the tips because his mother's disability check didn't stretch to the light bill anymore. He was not supposed to speak. He knew exactly, precisely to the dollar, what happened to a banquet server who spoke up to a man like Harrison Whitmore. He would be fired before he reached the kitchen doors, and there would be no reference, and the word would go quietly around the other houses on the peninsula. That boy's trouble. Don't hire him. Deshaun knew all of that. He stood against the wall with a tray of dirty flutes, and he felt his own heartbeat in his ears. And then he thought about his grandmother who had cleaned houses south of Broad for 30 years, and taught him that a man is not what he owns, but what he refuses to do for money. And he set the tray down on a table, and he walked 10 feet across an open floor, past 300 people who would not, and he stood next to Elijah Carter, and he turned to face the most powerful man in Charleston. "Sir," his voice cracked and he pulled it back level. "Last spring, this man climbed onto our loading dock and did CPR on Mr. Alvarez from the kitchen when his heart stopped. For 11 minutes, till the second unit came. I saw it. Half the back of the house saw it. He's a paramedic. He's not one word of what you're calling him. And I'm sorry, but I can't stand at that wall and pretend I didn't hear what you just said." The room inhaled as one. Harrison turned his head slowly toward the boy, the way a cannon swivels. "And you are?" "Nobody, sir," Deshaun said. "Just somebody who won't be able to sleep if I stay quiet. You're fired. Effective now. Turn in your jacket and get off my property." Deshaun's jaw worked once, and then, right there in front of 300 people, he reached up and began to unbutton the white banquet jacket. Slow, his hand steady now that the worst of it was already done. It was the single bravest thing anyone did in that ballroom all night. And it was done by the person in the room with the least in the world to spare. 22 years old, $18 an hour, and more spine than every millionaire in the building put together. Hold on to Deshaun Boyd. I promise you, the way this ends, he matters more than every senator in that room. Harrison wasn't finished. Men like Harrison are never finished when they've won. They stop only when they've destroyed. He crossed to the torn document because Caroline had ripped it clean in half by now and dropped it on the floor, and he picked up the two halves and held them high. You see this? My daughter just tore up her own future for a man who brings a certificate and somebody else's child to the table. And he let the pieces fall, and he ground them under the heel of his handmade shoe against the heart pine floor. That is what this marriage is worth to me. Less than the paper it's printed on. Margaret Whitmore chose that moment to move. She crossed the floor and came to stand at her husband's side, and she did not put a hand on his arm to stop him. She put it there to be seen, to show the room precisely where she stood. "Caroline, darling," she said, and her voice was smooth as cream and twice as cold, "your father only does this because he loves you. One day you'll understand." Caroline looked at her mother. Really looked at her the way you look at someone for the last time. "You stood by that staircase," she said quietly, "and you watched him call my husband filth and disown your own granddaughter. And you said nothing. Not one word. Family is sacrifice," Margaret said. "Sometimes the sacrifice is yours. No, Mama. Sometimes the sacrifice is your soul." And she turned her back on both of them. "If you're still with me, ask yourself something honestly right now, before we go on. Not what you'd like to think you'd do, what you would actually do. You are standing at that wall in a rented tux or a borrowed gown. You have a mortgage. You have a boss 3 feet away who could end your career with a phone call. And you watch a good man get torn apart in front of you for the crime of loving the wrong daughter. Are you the developer who turns to the dessert table? Are you Margaret, who walks over to stand beside the cruelty? Or are you a 22-year-old kid making $18 an hour, who sets the tray down anyway? Hold your answer. We'll come back to it." Harrison flicked a hand at his 2 security men, a small dismissive gesture, a king granting the banished their exit. "Let them go." The men stepped aside, and Elijah took his wife's hand, and Deshawn picked up his folded white jacket, and the 3 of them walked out through the tall brass doors into the cool marble hush of the lobby, past the antique Persian runner, past the 6-foot portrait of a man smiling down on a world he thought he still controlled. The noise of the ballroom faded behind the heavy doors. Caroline leaned against a cool plaster column and shut her eyes, and her hands would not stop trembling. Elijah didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was raw. "I'm sorry. I thought if he just met you and me, if he just saw us." "He saw exactly what we are," Elijah said. "That's the trouble. He looked at me and saw what he needed to see. Nothing I said in there was ever going to move him an inch." Deshawn stood a little apart, awkward, holding his jacket. "Man," he said, and gave a shaky laugh, "I think I just gave up the best-paying gig I ever had." Elijah put a hand on his shoulder and looked him dead in the eye. "You did the right thing. You hear me? What's your name?" "Deshawn Boyd." "Deshawn, you're going to remember tonight for the rest of your life, because a rich man showed you exactly who he is, and you showed a whole room exactly who you are. That's not nothing, son. That's everything." Caroline opened her eyes. "Should we call your mother?" Elijah touched the key at his throat. Warm from his skin, he had spent his whole adult life keeping that name locked in a drawer, never spending it, never using it, needing to know all the way down that everything he had he'd earned with his own hands. But tonight was not about his pride. Tonight a man had degraded his wife, his daughter, his marriage, and his grandmother's whole hard-won bloodline in front of 300 people, and every last one of them had watched and done nothing. Tonight was not about pride anymore. It was about the truth finally getting to stand up in that room and be counted. He pulled out his phone. 1 ring. 2. Then a warm, unhurried voice. "Hey, my boy." "Mama." His voice cracked on the word just once, and everything he had held together for the last hour rose up in his throat. "I know," Odessa said. "Caroline called me 20 minutes ago. I'm already here." "What?" "I'm sitting under the porte-cochere, baby. I've been out here 5 minutes deciding whether to walk in as a landlord or as your mother." Elijah closed his eyes. Almost laughed. "Almost. And what did you decide?" "I decided your mother," Odessa Carter said, "because that's the one he can't survive." The line went dead, and through the tall glass of the lobby doors they heard a car door close, soft and final, and then heels on old cobblestone. Slow, measured, completely unhurried. The footsteps of a woman who had walked into rooms far more dangerous than this one, and walked out of every single one of them on her own 2 feet. Elijah opened the lobby doors, and Odessa Carter stepped through. She was 62 years old, 5'9" in low heels, and she carried herself like a woman who had never once in her life waited for permission to enter a room. Silver hair swept straight back, a tailored suit the exact gray of a Charleston storm coming in off the water. No jewelry but a thin gold wedding band, decades old, and pinned to her lapel a small enamel pin shaped like a brass key, so quiet you'd never notice it unless you knew what it was. She took her son's face in both hands and kissed his forehead. "You all right, baby?" He nodded because if he opened his mouth he would break, and he wasn't ready yet. She pulled Caroline in and held her while she shook and murmured into her hair, "I've got you now, both of you, I've got you." Then she looked at the young man standing off to the side holding a folded white jacket. "And who's this?" "Deshaun Boyd, ma'am. He spoke up in there, got himself fired for it." Odessa Carter looked at that boy for a long, quiet moment, the way her mother used to look at a room she'd just made spotless. "Son," she said, "don't you go anywhere tonight?" She smoothed her jacket. She turned toward the ballroom doors, where 300 muffled voices leaked through the heavy wood. "Which one is he?" "You can't miss him," Elijah said. "He's the one standing under his own portrait." "Let's go correct that," Odessa said, in the calm, level voice of a woman who had closed ground leases across boardroom tables, full of men who had underestimated her exactly once. "This won't take long." She pushed both doors open, wide, and the sound of it cut across every conversation like a blade dropped on marble. 300 heads turned. The quartet stopped mid-note, and Odessa Carter walked into that ballroom the way a woman walks onto land she holds the deed to, because that is precisely what she was doing. Harrison was near the bar, bourbon freshened, laughing at something that wasn't funny with the developer from Mount Pleasant. He glanced toward the doors, and his laugh died in his throat. He knew the face, not from a family photo, from the Southeastern Hospitality Summit 2 years back, where he had waited 40 minutes in a receiving line just to shake this woman's hand, and been given 90 seconds and a business card. From the cover of Southern Business Quarterly, Sterling Meridian Trust surpasses $4 billion in Southern hotel real estate. From the framed photograph hanging in his own general counsel's office, this same woman standing beside the governor at a ribbon cutting downtown. She held the kind of quiet, patient power that made Harrison's gilt-framed fortune look like a stage set with a strong wind coming. The color drained out of his face in stages. First, the bourbon flush faded, then the certainty left his jaw. Then his eyes went wide with the first horrible spark of understanding. The understanding of a man who has just realized the ground is not where he thought it was. Odessa crossed the floor, and the crowd parted without being asked. They did not know who she was. But every last one of them knew what authority looked like when it walked toward you, unhurried, and did not blink. She stopped an arm's length from Harrison, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes, which somehow made everything worse for him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and her voice, low and even, carried to every corner of the silent room. "We've met. Twice, in fact. Once at the summit where you stood in my line 40 minutes and then forgot my face by the coat check. And once, though you certainly won't remember it, at a closing table 4 years ago. On the far side of a signature you didn't read carefully." Harrison's mouth opened. Nothing came out. A bead of bourbon slid over the tilted rim of his glass and dropped onto the toe of his polished shoe, and he did not notice. "The man you just called filth," Odessa said. "The man you ordered dragged off your property. The man whose marriage you tried to shred on a cocktail table in front of 300 witnesses. His name is Elijah Samuel Carter. He is my only son. He graduated at the top of his class. He has spent 11 years pulling the people of this county back from the edge of dying, with his own 2 hands, for a wage that wouldn't cover the flowers on one of your tables. And he is the most decent, the most steady, and by a distance the most honorable human being I have ever known." She let it settle like a stone dropped into still water, and she watched the rings spread across the faces of 300 people who had watched him bleed and said nothing. "Years ago, he asked me to keep my name out of his life," she went on. "He wanted to build his own worth with his own hands, so that no man could ever say he'd been handed a thing. And he did it. Every single piece of the life that boy has, he earned. She turned her head slowly, taking in the room, the senators, the widows, the pale associates against the wall. Which is why, until about 2 minutes ago, not one of you knew you were standing next to him, including you, Mr. Whitmore, especially you. She reached into her jacket and drew out a single business card, heavy cream stock. She set it on the bar in front of Harrison with 2 steady fingers. He looked down at it. Odessa R. Carter, Chairman, Sterling Meridian Hospitality Trust. And then, because he was a hotelier, and because some part of his brain was already running the numbers even as the rest of it drowned, Harrison Whitmore understood the full shape of the thing. Under the heart pine he was so proud of, under the crystal and the honeyed light and the 6-foot portrait of his own face, under the Beaumont itself, and under 6 other properties he ran across 3 states, sat the ground that this woman owned, the ground he leased, under a 20-year master lease and management agreement that was up for its first renewal in 90 days, and that carried, on page 19, a reputation and lawful conduct provision his own general counsel had drafted, back when everyone assumed a clause like that could only ever be used against some unruly franchisee, and never, not in 1,000 years, against the man whose name was on the door. Harrison's knees buckled. He caught the edge of the bar with both hands to keep from going down. His glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the heart pine, sharp and bright and final, like a gavel coming down on a verdict that could never be appealed. 300 guests stood in absolute silence. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, and Odessa Carter stood perfectly still, watching Harrison Whitmore understand, in front of every single person whose opinion he had spent his life purchasing, that the man he had just tried to destroy was the son of the woman who owned the floor beneath his feet. The silence held for 6 full seconds. In a room of 300 people, 6 seconds is an eternity. Then Harrison moved because he had to. He straightened, hand shaking, and reached for the mask, the founder's mask, the patriarch's mask he had worn so long he'd forgotten it was a mask at all. It would not go back on. It had shattered with the glass. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and the voice that came out was thin and reedy, a voice no one in that room had ever heard from Harrison Whitmore, small and uncertain and afraid. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I had no idea." "No idea," Odessa repeated, and let the 2 words hang. "No idea he was someone's son? Or no idea that anyone who could actually touch you would ever find out how you treat the people you've decided are beneath you?" The things I said, Harrison tried. They were the heat of the moment. Family runs hot. "You had 28 pages drafted this morning," she said, quiet and devastating. "You posted private security at your exits before my son arrived. You froze your own daughter's accounts with a phone call while I stood in your lobby. That is not the heat of the moment, Mr. Whitmore. That is a plan, executed, and a plan tells the truth about a man that a temper never could. You could have heard the ice settling in 300 abandoned drinks." Harrison stepped toward her, one hand extended, meaning to look cordial and landing somewhere near begging. "Surely we can discuss this privately. There's no reason any of this touches business. Sterling Meridian and Whitmore have a long and productive history." "You're right," Odessa said. "We do." And she looked at his hand, and she did not take it. She let it hang there in the air between them, unanswered, and every person in the room watched it hang. "That history comes up for renewal in 90 days, she said. "And whether it renews depends entirely on what I hear from you and see from your company between now and then. Because I will tell you plainly, Mr. Whitmore, Sterling Meridian does not lease its buildings to operators whose leadership conducts itself the way you just conducted yourself on my property, in front of 300 witnesses, with a documented pattern I intend to have my people examine very, very closely." Harrison's hand dropped. His eyes flicked around the ballroom for a single ally and found none. 300 faces looked back at him with everything from pity to open disgust, and not one of them stepped forward, because a room that will not defend an innocent man will certainly not defend a guilty one once the wind has changed. Margaret came to his side and turned to Odessa with a bright, practiced smile. "Mrs. Carter, perhaps we might schedule a proper meeting next week, once cooler heads have." "Mrs. Whitmore." Odessa cut her off without heat, which was worse than heat. "I watched you cross a room to stand beside your husband while he degraded my son and cast out your own child. Do not stand here now and speak to me of cooler heads." Margaret's smile came apart like wet plaster in the rain. Odessa took out her phone and dialed, and she did not step away, and the room heard every word. Andrew. It's Odessa. I'm sorry to call on a Friday night. I need the full file on every Sterling Meridian agreement with Whitmore Hospitality Group. Every ground lease, every management contract, every renewal date, every default provision. And I want the reputation and lawful conduct clauses pulled first, flagged, on my desk by 9 Monday morning. Yes, all of it. Thank you, Andrew. She hung up and looked at Harrison and delivered the sentence very quietly. 90 days. Here is what happens between now and then. You resign as chief executive of your company. You issue a real apology, not whatever your firm drafts for you at 3 in the morning. You step personally away from every property that stands on my land. And your board begins to answer for whatever it is my people are about to find. If I see none of that by Monday at noon, my legal team stops being polite. She paused. And Harrison, my legal team, does not lose. Harrison Whitmore's legs folded, and he sat down hard in a banquet chair, a size too small for a man whose empire had just become far too large to save. He put his head in his hands and his shoulders curved inward, like a building beginning to fail from the inside. For the first time all night, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he had nothing whatsoever to say. Across the room, Franklin Doyle, Whitmore's general counsel, was already in motion. He had known for 18 minutes. A calendar alert, a cross-reference of the guest list, the name Carter beside the words Sterling Meridian, and his stomach had gone to water. He had not warned his boss. Lawyers always know the exact moment to begin building distance from a sinking ship. He gathered his briefcase, and he crossed the ballroom, and he positioned himself out in the lobby, near Caroline, 3 separate rooms away from Harrison. Mrs. Carter, he said to Caroline low. That is, Mrs. I should call you. He gave up. We should talk Monday. Just the two of us. Caroline nodded once and said nothing, because she understood exactly what she was watching. She was watching the rats find the rope. And then Charlotte Calhoun rose from her corner table. Harrison's older sister, 70 years old, who had wept silently into her napkin all evening and said not one word. She crossed the whole length of the ballroom on unsteady heels, past her brother slumped in his little chair, and she took both of Caroline's hands in both of hers, and the tears came fresh. I'm sorry, she said, and her voice broke clean in half. I should have said something, years ago. Tonight. Every single time, I should have said something, and I sat there, and I ate the shrimp, and I said nothing, and I am so ashamed. Caroline squeezed her hands. Thank you, Aunt Lottie. It was the first honest thing a Whitmore had done all night, and it had taken the total collapse of the family to shake it loose. Remember Charlotte, too. Her one act of courage came late. But it came and it stayed, and that counts for more than you'd think. Odessa put her arm around her son. Caroline came to his other side. Deshawn stood a step behind them with his folded jacket, and the 4 of them walked out of the Beaumont together through the tall brass doors, and behind them the ballroom stayed frozen. 300 people and a shattered man, and above the staircase, a portrait of somebody who no longer existed. Harrison slumped in his chair. Margaret stood alone by the bar, clutching her pearls like a woman going over the side of a boat. And 300 guests at last reached for their phones. Not to help, to tell the story. The first text left that ballroom at 9:47 p.m. By midnight, the city knew. By sunrise, the country knew. And by the following week, the machinery of the actual world, the slow, patient, unglamorous machinery of law and money and consequence, had begun to turn, and it would not stop until Harrison Whitmore had paid for every single word. Here is a thing worth stopping on because it's the whole point. Odessa Carter never raised her voice. She never threatened him with a fist or a scandal or a lie. She simply held up the pages he had signed himself and let the truth do what the truth does when you finally stop protecting it. That is the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is loud, and it needs your hand on it the whole way. Justice is quiet and patient, and all it has ever needed is the truth, written down, and someone with the standing to read it aloud. It started, as these things do now, with the audio. Somebody at the gala, and no one ever confirmed who, had been recording on a phone from the moment Harrison first raised his finger. The clip was shaky and the background clinked with champagne, but every word was knife-clear, gutter trash. You people. My daughter has no husband. She has a mistake. 43 seconds of a rich man tearing a good man apart, and his own daughter with him. It hit social media at 11:14 that night. By 2 in the morning, it had 4 million views. By the Monday commute, it was leading on cable, playing on a loop, and news anchors were saying the words filth and you people out loud on air with their faces carefully arranged. And something happened then that Harrison, in his whole insulated life, had never once had to reckon with. The clip did not stay in the boardrooms and the newsrooms. It went to the people. It went to the maids and the valets and the line cooks and the bellmen of Charleston, the whole invisible army that had kept his palaces gleaming for decades, while he looked straight through them. A housekeeper at another downtown hotel watched it on her phone on her lunch break and wept, not because it surprised her, but because for the first time in her life somebody had gotten caught. A retired schoolteacher on John's Island shared it with a caption that read, "My mother cleaned those rooms," and it was seen 2 million times by nightfall. Outside the Beaumont, on the sidewalk along East Bay Street, people began to leave things: flowers, notes, a child's drawing of an ambulance. One handwritten card, taped to the wrought iron, simply said, "Thank you for reminding us who the important people always were." Stop and sit with that, because it's the part the powerful never see coming. A man like Harrison Whitmore believes the world is the 200 people who can do something for him. He forgets there is another world entirely, 10 times larger, made up of the people who do things for him, and that world has a very long memory and a very quiet voice, right up until the day it doesn't. He spent 30 years being rude to the wrong people, and he never understood that there is no such thing as the wrong people. There is only how you treat them, and the bill that comes due. The headline that stuck came from a reporter named Renata Vance at the Charleston Ledger, who had been chasing discrimination in the low-country hospitality industry for the better part of a decade and had a drawer full of sources she'd never had the peg to use. The gala gave her the peg. Her piece ran Monday at 7 a.m., and it did not stop at the ballroom. Hotel Dynasty's CEO in racist tirade. The man he called filth is the son of the woman who owns his hotels. Vance had been working the inside of Whitmore Hospitality for months, and now, with the audio giving them cover, people talked. A banquet captain who had been passed over for promotion 4 times in 6 years, despite the highest guest satisfaction scores in the building. A former front desk manager who described Harrison instructing a department head, in a closed meeting, to maintain the right sort of clientele for the brand, and everyone in that room understanding exactly what color the wrong sort was. A retired HR coordinator who kept copies, because people who are afraid keep copies, of internal emails in which Harrison directed recruiting to weight candidates for cultural fit, a phrase that in his company had always meant one specific thing. And here is where the law walks on stage, and it does not walk off again, because there had been a lawsuit before. In 2019, 3 former employees had sued Whitmore Hospitality for racial discrimination, and Harrison's lawyers had made it disappear the way rich men's lawyers do: a quiet settlement, a non-disclosure agreement, a check in exchange for silence. Harrison had believed for 6 years that he had bought the whole thing outright. He was wrong about that, the way he was wrong about most things concerning people he considered beneath him. Because a non-disclosure agreement can buy a person's silence about a settlement. It cannot, under federal law, stop that person from filing a charge with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and it cannot stop them from cooperating with a federal investigation. You cannot sign away that right. No amount of money can purchase it. Harrison's own lawyers knew this in 2019 and had simply gambled that no one would ever have a reason to test it. The gala gave them a reason. 2 of the 3 original plaintiffs went to the EEOC within the week. The market, which has no conscience but an excellent sense of smell, moved first. Whitmore Hospitality Group traded publicly under the ticker WHG, and by the closing bell that Tuesday the stock was off 26%. Institutional money began to walk. A state pension fund, a university endowment that could not afford the headline, an insurance company in Hartford that quietly instructed its managers to reduce exposure. None of them did it out of principle. They did it because toxicity is bad for returns, and a CEO caught on tape is the most toxic asset in the world. But the thing that actually broke Harrison Whitmore was not the market and not the news. It was the paper. It was always going to be the paper. Because Harrison did not own his hotels. He operated them on land that belonged to Sterling Meridian, under that master lease with the reputation and lawful conduct provision on page 19, the clause Franklin Doyle himself had drafted years ago, and now could not stop reading in his sleep. On Wednesday morning, Sterling Meridian's general counsel sent formal notice. 3 paragraphs written with the precision of a surgeon. Sterling Meridian Hospitality Trust hereby provides notice of a material breach under Section 9 of the Master Lease and Management Agreement, arising from documented conduct by the operator's chief executive that has materially harmed the reputation and value of the leased premises, together with an emerging pattern of unlawful employment practices at the property. The trust demands immediate and verifiable corrective action by the operator's board of directors, failing which the trust will pursue termination of the flagship agreement. And here is where the dominoes Harrison had spent his own career lining up began to fall in the one direction he'd never imagined. The Beaumont lease was the collateral behind a $210 million construction loan on a half-built luxury resort out on Kiowa Island, Harrison's big final legacy project, the one that was going to have his name carved over the door. The loan carried a covenant, standard boilerplate, the kind of clause nobody reads, requiring Whitmore to keep its key leases in good standing. Lose the flagship lease, breach the covenant. Breach the covenant, the bank has the right to call the loan. $210 million due, all at once, on a building with no roof. Harrison had built that trap himself, brick by brick, over 4 years, and now he stood inside it and watched the door swing shut. One of the people Renata Vance found was a woman named Gloria Timmons. She had worked the front desk at the Beaumont for 19 years, through 3 general managers. And she had been named Employee of the Year twice, and she had applied for a management position 4 separate times and been told 4 separate times that she wasn't quite the right fit for the guest-facing role. While men she'd trained walked past her into the office she'd wanted, she had never said a word about it. She had a mortgage and a son in college, and she needed the job. But when Renata Vance sat across from her at a diner on Meeting Street and slid a phone across the table and pressed play on 43 seconds of Harrison Whitmore, Gloria Timmons listened to the whole thing, and then she looked up and said quietly, "I've got the emails." And I kept everyone, because a part of me always knew I'd need them someday. People who are afraid keep receipts. It is the one small power fear gives you. And Harrison had spent 30 years making a great many people afraid, and every one of them had been keeping receipts. And now, all at once, they stopped being afraid. The board of Whitmore Hospitality called an emergency session that Wednesday evening in a glass conference room, 40 floors above the harbor. It was not a long meeting. The general counsel, who was not Franklin Doyle, because Franklin Doyle had already recused himself in writing, laid out the exposure in a flat voice. The stock, the EEOC, the class action, the lease notice, the loan covenant, the $210 million sitting on a roofless building on Kiowa. And when he was done, the lead independent director, a retired banker named Eleanor Pruitt, who had sat silent on that board for 9 years and watched Harrison run it like a private kingdom, folded her hands on the table and said, "We have a fiduciary duty, and it is not to him." 9 directors voted to demand Harrison's immediate resignation. 2 abstained. Both were his own personal appointees, men he had put on that board himself, and even they could not bring themselves to defend him on the record, because the record was now a very dangerous place to be standing. The resolution passed unanimously on the second ballot, his own hand-picked board. Not one single vote in his favor. Think about that for a moment. Every person in that room owed Harrison Whitmore something. A seat, a salary, a career. And when the moment came when protecting him meant standing in front of the truth themselves, not one of them would do it. That is the thing the cruel never seem to understand until it's far too late. The loyalty you buy with fear is only ever on loan, and the note comes due on the worst night of your life. Harrison spent that night in his study on Laguerre Street, under his own portraits, calling the directors one at a time, trying to negotiate and threaten and charm his way back into a chair that no longer existed. Nobody picked up. Every single call rolled to voicemail, and the silence on those lines was louder than anything Harrison Whitmore had ever shouted across a ballroom. It was Margaret who finally broke through. at 11 o'clock in her robe, standing in the doorway of his study. She said 7 words, and they ended the argument. And they told you everything about what that marriage had always actually been. If you don't resign, we lose everything. He resigned Thursday morning. The public apology was recorded in his home office in front of a ring light his assistant bought at a drugstore on the way over. Navy suit, silver hair. He read the statement off a teleprompter with all the enthusiasm of a man reading his own obituary aloud. I deeply regret the hurtful remarks I made at our founder's gala. My words do not reflect the values of Whitmore Hospitality or of my family. I take full responsibility and I am committed to learning and growth. The internet did to it what the internet does to an apology with no sorrow in it. He's sorry he got caught. Learning and growth, sir, you're 63. Somebody made a short clip of his face dissolving into a sandcastle knocked flat by a wave, and it went around for weeks. The EEOC opened a formal investigation into Whitmore Hospitality's hiring and promotion practices the following Monday. A class action followed 2 weeks after that. 6 former employees now, all of them black, alleging systemic discrimination in hiring, promotion, and pay stretching back more than a decade. And the discovery process in that suit would eventually pull the cultural fit emails into the sunlight, where a jury could read them. Harrison was quietly removed from 2 other corporate boards and asked to step down from the vestry of the church his family had endowed for 4 generations. His membership at the yacht club on the Ashley River was placed under review, which in Charleston is the genteel way of telling a man to please stop coming. And not $1 of it came from a miracle. Understand that. There was secret weapon, no dramatic ambush, no long-lost document falling out of the sky. Harrison Whitmore was destroyed by a lease he didn't read, a clause his own lawyer wrote, a loan covenant he'd leveraged past the breaking point, emails he assumed no one would ever see, and a company he had run for 30 years like a plantation instead of a hotel. Odessa Carter did not have to lift a hand. She simply held up the pages the man had signed with his own name and let the country he lived in do exactly what its laws were written to do. That is the lesson, if there is one. Cruelty leaves a paper trail. It always has. The only question is whether anyone with the standing to read it aloud is ever in the room. On one autumn night on a heart pine floor she happened to own, somebody finally was. 6 months later, here is where every last one of them landed. Harrison Whitmore never returned to the corner office he had held for 23 years. The class action settled for $68 million, the largest workplace discrimination settlement in the region's hospitality history. The EEOC investigation ended in a consent decree, a legally binding one, requiring mandatory anti-discrimination training across the company, an independent compliance monitor reporting to the federal government, and quarterly reports for 5 years. His personal fortune, a paper too. $1 billion the morning of the gala, most of it locked in WHG stock and the operating company, came apart to something closer to $400 million once the crash and the settlement and the legal fees were done with it. He sold the house on Laguerre Street, the one with his portraits, and moved to a smaller place up in Somerville, off the beaten path, with no staff and no security detail, and no invitations. Court records show he was ordered, as a term of a separate civil matter, to complete a 12-session diversity education course. He attended every session. He sat in the back row of a community college classroom with a paper visitor badge clipped to his lapel, learning the sort of grade school lessons about human dignity that most decent people understand by the age of 6. He finished the course in complete silence, and he spoke to no one, and no one spoke to him. Margaret Whitmore filed for divorce 4 months after the gala. In her sworn deposition, she testified, the record under oath, that Harrison had used racial slurs routinely and without hesitation in private for the entire 31 years of their marriage, and that she had stayed silent, not out of agreement, but out of financial dependence. The admission cost him in the settlement, and it cost her nothing she hadn't already spent. She took a large sum and the house in Palm Beach and the maiden name she'd been born with, and she was never heard from publicly again. The board of Whitmore Hospitality, scrambling for a face the market could trust, offered the interim chief executive position to Caroline. She had grown up in that company. She had learned to walk in its lobbies. She knew where the bones were. She accepted on the board's conditions a total overhaul of hiring and promotion, a genuine independent audit, a supplier program that put real money into minority-owned businesses. And she added one condition of her own in writing, that neither Elijah nor her mother-in-law Odessa would have any hand whatsoever in a single decision she made. She wanted to earn it the way her husband had earned everything in his life. On her own terms, with her own two hands, so that no one could ever say she'd been handed the chair. Under her leadership, the company hired its first black executive vice president, a woman named Adeze Okoro, who had in fact applied twice during Harrison's tenure and been passed over both times. When a reporter later asked Caroline what she had changed to turn the company around, she gave an answer that became its own headline. The leadership, she said. Everything else was already there. It was always there. Nobody upstairs had ever bothered to look. Now, you remember Deshaun Boyd, 22 years old, $18 an hour, who set the tray down and walked across the floor. Odessa Carter does not forget a person who stands up when standing up costs them everything they have. The Monday after the gala, an assistant from Sterling Meridian's foundation office called an apartment off Rivers Avenue and asked to speak with Deshaun. Sterling Meridian ran a 2-year management fellowship, full salary, tuition covered at the College of Charleston, a program built to walk a promising young person from the floor of a hotel to the front office. Deshaun started that January. 18 months later, he was assistant director of guest operations at the Beaumont, wearing a suit instead of a banquet jacket, walking the same heart pine floor where he had once set down a tray of dirty flutes and chosen his soul over his shift. He kept that white jacket, though, folded in the top drawer of his dresser. When people asked, he told them it reminded him what the right thing costs, and that it had turned out to be worth every penny of the price he thought he was paying. Odessa established the Ruth Carter Foundation, named for her mother, the girl who had cleaned rooms she was not allowed to sleep in, with a $12 million endowment. The foundation funds scholarships and paid apprenticeships in 2 fields, hospitality and emergency medicine, for the children of hotel workers and first responders across the Lowcountry. It has written into its bylaws a single unusual rule. Every scholarship recipient is given, on the day they accept, a small brass tag with a room number stamped into it and a card that reads in a careful hand, "This is not a memory. It's a promise." Elijah helped design the whole program and took no public credit for any of it. The website lists him, to this day, only as a board advisor. And Elijah Carter went back to work at Charleston County EMS the Monday after the gala, the same as any other Monday. He clocked in at 6 a.m., he put on the gray-elbowed uniform, he rode out on Unit 41. And that afternoon he knelt on a bathroom floor off Spruill Avenue and breathed for a grandmother whose heart had stopped in front of her grandchildren. And he brought her back, and he held her hand in the rig the whole way to the hospital, and told her, in a low, steady voice, "I've got you now. You're not going anywhere." When a television producer called the station, wanting an interview about the gala, about the billionaire's son who drove an ambulance, Elijah gave them exactly 6 words, and they ran them under his photograph on the evening news. People still need saving. That's constant. He and Caroline bought a modest house up in Hampton Park, 4 bedrooms, a live oak in the yard older than the city's memory. And one Saturday, Elijah climbed that oak himself and hung a rope swing for his daughter. Modest by Whitmore standards, perfect by theirs. There is one more thing he did that no reporter ever heard about. A few weeks after it all settled, Elijah took the cashier's check for $75,000 out of his nightstand drawer, the one he'd never cashed, the one that had sat there for 4 years under his father's watch. He didn't tear it up. He mailed it back to Harrison Whitmore in Somerville, uncashed, with a card of his own. It said, "I was never for sale, but I forgive you anyway. My grandmother would have wanted me to." No one knows whether Harrison ever read it. But Elijah slept better once it was gone from the house. Caroline and Elijah renewed their vows on a Saturday afternoon in October, a year to the week after the gala, in a garden off Rutledge Avenue under the Spanish moss. 30 guests, no ballroom in sight, no string quartet, just a friend of Elijah's from the fire department playing a guitar. Odessa walked Caroline down the aisle, at Caroline's own asking, because Harrison would not, and Caroline would not have had him if he'd begged. It turned out the woman who owned the land was the one glad to give the bride away. No Whitmore came, except Charlotte Calhoun, who arrived early with a handwritten letter of apology so long it took her 3 cards to finish, and a stuffed dolphin for Naomi that was nearly as big as Naomi. Charlotte became, from that day, the only member of the Whitmore family to keep any relationship at all with Elijah and Caroline. She comes to Sunday supper in Hampton Park once a month, without fail, and she always brings something small for the child. And it is the most honest apology she knows how to make, and she makes it over and over, which is the only kind of apology that has ever meant anything. Naomi was the flower girl. She scattered her petals with the fierce, frowning concentration of a 6-year-old on an important mission. And then, when the guitar stopped and the garden went quiet and everyone was waiting for the vows, she turned to the assembled guests and announced, in a clear, ringing voice, that my grandma owns the hotels and my daddy saves people's lives. Nobody corrected her. There was nothing to correct. She was exactly right on both counts, and she said it the way you'd say the sky is blue, because in her whole life no one had ever once suggested it should have been any other way. That right there was the entire point of everything. Ruth Carter had scrubbed marble she couldn't cross so that one day a little girl with purple beads in her braids could stand in a garden and say those words as though they were the most ordinary facts in the world. Odessa Carter stepped back from the day-to-day at Sterling Meridian the following spring, though she kept her chairman's seat. The trust did, in the end, renew the Whitmore lease under Caroline's leadership, with new terms requiring independent diversity audits at every property, every year, for as long as the paper holds. Odessa splits her time now between the foundation and her granddaughter. She picks Naomi up from school on Thursdays, and they get pralines from the same shop on King Street every single week, and they walk down past Rainbow Row to look at the water. And she tells that little girl the story about her great-great-grandmother Ruth, who came off John's Island as a girl and cleaned the grand hotels of Charleston through a service door on the alley, and who told her own daughter, over a dented pot of red rice, "They will let you clean the palace, baby. They just won't let you live in it. So you go build your own." Sometimes at supper, Odessa reaches over and takes the brass key off her son's neck and lets Naomi hold it. Room 214. The tag soft as cloth now, the ink nearly gone, and she says, "This is not a memory, baby. It's a promise. Your great-great-grandmother made it on her knees 70 years ago, and every single one of us has carried it since. And your daddy kept it every day of his life, and one day you'll carry it too." And Naomi holds the little worn key in her small hand like it's made of gold, because in every way that has ever mattered, it is. So here is my question for you. And I mean it, give me an honest answer, not the one you'd like to be true. If you had been in that ballroom, one of those 300 people in silk and pearls, watching a man tear into a paramedic whose only crime was loving the wrong daughter, who would you have been? Would you have been the developer who turned to the dessert table? Would you have been the judge's wife who looked straight through him? Would you have been Margaret, who crossed the floor to stand beside the cruelty and call it love? Would you have been Charlotte, weeping into your napkin with your mouth shut, telling yourself that saying something wouldn't help? Or, when it counted, when it cost, would you have set the tray down like Deshaun Boyd, walked 10 feet across an open floor past 300 people who wouldn't, and said the true thing out loud, knowing exactly what it would take from you? Be honest. Tell me in the comments. Because I think most of us like to believe we're the one who sets down the tray. And I think the whole tragedy of that ballroom is that all 300 of them believed it too, right up until the moment they had to prove it. Here is what I want you to carry out of this story, the same way Elijah carried that key, the way a man treats people when he is certain no one important is watching. That is who he actually is. Harrison Whitmore looked around that ballroom and decided no one important was in it, and he was wrong. Because there is always someone important in the room. Sometimes it's the quiet woman in the storm gray suit who happens to own the floor under your feet. But far more often, and this is the part I need you to hear, it's a 22-year-old kid in a borrowed jacket making $18 an hour, who decides he would rather lose the job than lose himself. Both of them were important. The world only found out about one of them because she owned a building. The other one was important all along, and it never had a thing to do with money. And if you are the person in this story who has ever been told you are not enough, not rich enough, not connected enough, Not the right kind of people? Not the right color to stand in somebody's ballroom? Then hear me, because this is the part that's actually for you. The problem was never you, it was always them. Real love, the kind worth having, does not ask you to shrink. It does not trade you for a name or an inheritance or a seat at somebody's table. It tears up the paper. It takes your hand. It walks out the door beside you, and it does not once look back. And the people who see your worth, the real ones, see it from the very first day. They never need you to prove it, because they were never confused about it in the first place. Ruth Carter cleaned rooms she was not allowed to sleep in, and she told her daughter to go build her own. Her daughter built an empire and gave it a plain name and raised a son who chose to save lives with his own 2 hands. And that son wore an old brass key into a room full of people who thought he was nobody, and he held his head up, and he never said a word, and he let the truth stand up and speak for itself. That is the whole inheritance, not the money, the key. If this story moved you tonight, if it made you angry or hopeful or both at once, do something small for me. Hit that like button, so it reaches one more person who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong in the room. And subscribe, because there are more of these coming every week. Real stories about real dignity and real consequence, and the quiet people who turn out to matter most. And before you close this, answer me one honest question, down in the comments, where I'll be reading. Have you ever stood in a room and watched an injustice happen, and stayed silent because speaking would have cost you? What did it cost you to stay quiet instead? Tell me, I want to know, because the world does not change in the boardrooms and the ballrooms. It changes in the 10 feet of open floor a scared young man decides, against every reason he has, to walk across anyway. Be the one who sets the tray down. It is always worth the price. Ruth Carter never got to see any of it. She died long before her grandson wore her key into that ballroom, before her great-granddaughter scattered petals in a garden and told the world what her family was. But somewhere in a shotgun house on the east side of Charleston 70 years ago, a tired girl looked at her daughter over a pot of red rice and made a promise she would not live to see kept. Keep it anyway. Whatever your ballroom is, whatever your kiwi is, whatever promise somebody made on their knees so that you could stand up straight, keep it. That is how the world actually changes, one kept promise at a time.